a lot of attention when General Motors shows it to us tonight. Today, the company announced that it's making a substantial investment.
GM just shut down U.S. plants. 50,000 jobs gone overnight. They called tariffs protection, but instead of saving jobs, they killed them. Plants went silent, suppliers collapsed, and entire towns started to unravel. So why was this allowed to happen? Who's really paying the price? And what comes next for the families left behind? By the end, you'll see. This isn't just GM's crisis, it's America's. The tariff trigger? This wasn't a policy tweak, it was a ticking bomb under Detroit's assembly lines. When the White House announced a 25% tariff on imported vehicles and auto components in April of 2025, the intent was sold as patriotic: protect American jobs, restore industrial power, and punish foreign competitors. In reality, it detonated at the heart of General Motors. Within days of the announcement, analysts calculated that the measure would drain between $4 and $5 billion from GM's earnings this year alone. Mary Barra, GM's chief executive officer, issued a blunt shareholder letter on May 29th, warning that the company's Ultium battery research and development program would be starved of resources. Ultium was supposed to be GM's future, its pathway to dominating the electric market. Instead, the very lifeblood of that future was now diverted just to cover new costs. The problem wasn't abstract. Nearly 40% of parts in GM's best-selling models still came from abroad. Every Silverado truck, every Equinox sport utility vehicle, and every Escalade luxury car carried imported components. And now each of those parts came with a punishing tariff. Wall Street heard the warning, but the impact would be felt most clearly far from trading floors. Numbers alone could never capture the real shock. The proof was waiting on the factory floor in absolute silence. Cost explosion. Every truck rolling off the line just got $3,200 more expensive overnight. That was the immediate arithmetic of tariffs piled atop existing steel and aluminum duties. A steering knuckle that cost $28 yesterday now came in at $36. Multiply that across 30,000 components, and you begin to see how GM's balance sheet started bleeding red ink. For a moment, executives attempted to absorb the hit. They delayed passing price hikes on to consumers, hoping that relief would come from Washington. But relief never came. Wall Street, unimpressed by GM's hesitation, forced their hand. By mid-year, price increases rippled across dealership lots, eroding consumer confidence and souring demand just as the summer selling season began. The fallout didn't stop at GM's own margins. Suppliers felt the squeeze first. Adient, a seat manufacturer, saw input costs jump by 20%. Smaller machine shops that had depended on stable contracts suddenly found themselves unable to fulfill orders without losing money. Some tried to renegotiate, others quietly shuttered. GM's finance team had calculated that every billion lost to tariffs meant a billion cut from future programs. The much-touted Ultium battery fund was one of the first casualties. What had been pitched as a revolution in electric vehicles now looked like a distant dream. Those ballooning costs didn't just live in spreadsheets. They were about to slam straight into the assembly gates. If you're starting to realize how deep this goes, hit that like button so more people see the truth behind the headlines. Leave a comment below. Tell me how rising costs and plant shutdowns are hitting your community. Your stories matter, and they make this more than numbers. They make it personal. Plant silent. The loudest sound in Detroit wasn't a machine, it was the click of toolboxes closing. On April 11th, GM's Factory Zero paused production. 200 workers were sent home, officially told that demand had slowed, yet whispers on the floor suggested the truth. Parts had become too costly, and margins had evaporated. By late April, the Kami plant in Ingersoll, Ontario, halted bright drop van output until October. On May 2nd, 1,200 workers were laid off. At Oshawa, the overnight truck shift disappeared, eliminating 700 jobs in one stroke. Outside the gates, parking lots filled with idle trailers, each one a mute monument to stalled production. The impact radiated into the towns that depended on those plants. Michigan diners reported losing 40% of their customers almost overnight. An Indiana auto parts shop warned that if idling lasted more than a month, half its staff could be gone. Local newspapers ran photos of empty break rooms, and the phrase elastic idling became shorthand for lives suspended. This wasn't a return to the golden age of American auto production. It was a chilling echo of Lordstown's 2019 closure. Workers packed their toolboxes with the same grim caution, unsure if they would ever return. As the towns grew quieter, another storm gathered, not in the streets, but in the markets. Wall Street panic. When investors smell weakness, they don't wait, they slash. By early May, Wall Street analysts had already cut GM's earnings outlook by 18%, citing the combined blow of tariffs and declining consumer demand. Credit rating agencies whispered of downgrades. GM's share price slid, dragging down retirement portfolios and rattling investor confidence across the sector. The market wasn't just punishing GM for tariffs, it was punishing the uncertainty of an entire strategy. For years, GM had promised to reinvent itself as an electric leader, pouring billions milliards into Ultium, promising hundreds of thousands of EVs on the road. Now the very capital meant to fund that transition was being siphoned to plug short-term holes. Investors began asking hard questions. Was GM still a growth story, or had it become a casualty of political chess? Could a company that once symbolized American industrial might survive as margins collapsed? Brokerage reports painted a stark picture, a $5 billion tariff wound on top of existing debt burdens. The panic was contagious. Suppliers saw their stock tumble. Regional banks with auto exposure tightened lending. Communities already bruised by layoffs wondered how long property values would hold. The tremors on Wall Street didn't stay confined to traders. They began to shake the backbone of America's supplier towns. Supplier casualties. When the giant stumbles, its suppliers fall first. The first wave of pain from GM's shutdown did not hit the corporate towers of Detroit, but the smaller shops and factories that lived on GM contracts. In Tennessee, Adient announced it would close 2 plants, cutting 400 union jobs. These were not faceless numbers. They were upholsterers, machinists, and drivers whose livelihoods depended on weekly orders from GM's assembly lines. In Ontario, parts plants tied to the Cami facility saw cascading layoffs as Bright Drop van production halted. Small contractors, who had borrowed heavily to expand capacity, suddenly faced the terrifying math of loan payments with no incoming revenue. A steering column supplier in Windsor, barely 10 miles from Detroit, lost 70% of its orders in a single week. Workers packed up, many not knowing if they would ever clock in again. The shock spread further than payrolls. A trucker who hauled seats from Tennessee to Michigan saw his routes canceled. Local cafes lost the morning rush of line workers grabbing coffee. One diner owner in Ingersoll described it as losing half the town in one weekend. The suppliers were the first dominoes, but they would not be the last. The collapse was spreading outward, touching every corner of the North American auto economy. From the factory floor to the coffee counter, the ripples of collapse were spreading into every corner of daily life. But politics was waiting to fan the flames even higher. Union fractures. Tariffs split the union halls right down the middle. For decades, unions had been the bulwark of auto workers, binding together across plants and borders. But the 25% tariff lit a fire under old divisions. In Detroit, United Auto Workers president Shawn Fain hailed the tariffs as finally putting American jobs first. He claimed they would force companies like GM to bring production back home. North of the border, Unifor saw it differently. In Ontario, where thousands of Canadian jobs hung on exports to the United States, leaders accused GM of sacrificing Canadian livelihoods to score political points in Washington. A Unifor local president blasted the policy, saying, "Our members are paying for someone else's campaign slogan." On the shop floors, the arguments turned personal. In break rooms, workers who once stood side by side during strikes now snapped at each other. Some insisted tariffs were worth short-term pain for long-term gain. Others muttered that they could not pay mortgages with promises. A worker in Flint described the atmosphere as every man for himself. Divided workers made corporate cost-cutting easier. Management thrived when unions were fractured, and the tariff debate fractured them deeply. What should have been solidarity became suspicion, and into that division stepped global competitors ready to take advantage. The louder the divisions echoed inside union halls, the wider the door opened for competitors ready to seize the opportunity. Competitors struggle. GM's stumble triggered aftershocks across the auto world. Stellantis, parent of Chrysler, saw its Windsor minivan plant facing 12 weeks of erratic scheduling. In Michigan and Indiana, 900 workers were laid off as production lines slowed. Dealer lots filled with unsold Pacificas, yet sticker prices kept climbing thanks to tariff-inflated Chinese parts. Volvo Group North America braced for layoffs of 1,000 workers in Pennsylvania and Virginia. Fleet buyers balked at rigs that now cost $180,000, up from $165,000 overseas. GM Korea, which exported nearly 90% of its output to the United States, warned that 25% tariffs could push it to the brink of collapse, echoing the company's Australian retreat in 2017. Hyundai and Kia rushed to expand their Alabama and Georgia operations, hoping to dodge tariff costs. Yet those jobs would not arrive until 2027. In the meantime, supply chains strained. A single piston, made in Mexico, might cross the border 3 times during production, each crossing now subject to tariff fees. One Ontario supplier reported losing $1.2 million in a single week because of a customs error. Globally, the auto world was tilting toward retrenchment. Factories abroad were shuttering in response, yet the harshest impact was still unfolding in American living rooms. The human toll. In Indiana, one family's mortgage now hangs on a paused assembly line. The father worked nights at GM's Fort Wayne truck plant. The mother waited tables at a diner that lost half its customers after the layoffs. Together, they had stretched their finances to buy a modest house. Now, with shifts canceled and tips dwindling, they faced the question of whether they could make the next payment. Across Michigan, stories echoed the same theme. A line worker who had been proud to put his kids through college now worried about affording tuition. A parts driver in Tennessee, out of work for the first time in 20 years, admitted he had applied for a job at a big box retailer just to keep health insurance. For many, it wasn't just the paycheck, it was the identity. GM had been the bedrock of their lives, and suddenly it felt like sand slipping away. The psychological toll was as visible as the financial. Toolboxes stayed packed by doors, ready in case the call never came. Children asked parents why their schools were cutting sports programs after local tax revenues plunged. Communities that once defined themselves by pride in American cars now whispered about moving away. The numbers showed billions lost, but the reality was homes, families, and futures shaken. While families struggled to hold on, executives downtown were already sketching a daring response that could change everything. Reshoring gamble. $4 billion? That's GM's price to buy back American time. In the wake of shuttered lines and collapsing forecasts, the company unveiled an ambitious plan to reshore production. Billions were earmarked for Tennessee, Michigan, and Kansas facilities, a bold attempt to shield themselves from the tariff storm. Executives boasted that reshoring would mean greater resilience, more jobs, and a symbolic rebuke to globalized dependence. The investments were not abstract. In Spring Hill, Tennessee, construction cranes began rising over a new battery pack plant. In Michigan, the Orion assembly revamp was slated to absorb $2 billion of the funds, promising to eventually churn out electric pickups without a single imported module. Kansas was tapped for an expanded stamping facility that would localize critical parts production. But every dollar carried risk. Building new lines required months, sometimes years. Equipment had to be sourced, suppliers had to be vetted, and workforce training had to begin almost from scratch. All the while, the bleeding continued. GM hoped that by 2027, the reshoring gamble would pay off. But for workers living through 2025, that promise felt far away. Hope in blueprints did not pay mortgages. Reshoring was a lifeline tied to a slow clock, while losses mounted daily. Blueprints and budgets promised salvation, yet the ticking clock threatened to turn that promise into dust. EV bottleneck. The EV dream turned into a parking lot full of unsold trucks. Factory Zero, once celebrated as GM's electric flagship, had rows of Silverado EVs sitting under tarps, their gleaming paint dulled by dust. Tariffs on imported minerals made Ultium batteries more expensive. Repealed federal tax credits stripped away the key incentive buyers once relied on. Forecasts had promised 100,000 sales per year, but 2025 projections now hovered around 65,000. GM tried to stimulate demand with 0% financing, but insurance premiums and rising electricity rates erased the appeal. Consumers grew wary of charging station shortages, which had worsened after Congress froze funding for national networks. The dream of effortless electric adoption was colliding with a harsher reality. EVs were too expensive, too inconvenient, and too uncertain for the average family. For GM, each unsold EV was not just a stranded asset, it was a liability. Every vehicle tied up around $45,000 in capital. Batteries degrading in storage heat, value evaporating with every week they sat idle. A market that was supposed to propel GM into the future was now dragging it backwards. Investors saw the contradiction clearly. A company betting its identity on EV leadership had stumbled into an oversupplied, under-demanded bottleneck. With rows of EVs gathering dust, the grand future vision began to look more like a trap than a triumph. Strategic uncertainty. Every lever, demand, supply, policy, was working against GM. At the very moment it needed stability, the foundations of its strategy shifted beneath it. Rare earth minerals critical for Ultium batteries were suddenly harder to obtain after trade disputes with China. Prices for key electronics surged when new tariffs on Japanese and Korean imports were announced in July. Even wiring harnesses from Brazil faced logistical hurdles that delayed shipments by weeks. Policy uncertainty compounded the challenge. In Washington, debates over subsidies gridlocked Congress, leaving automakers guessing which credits would survive the political season. State governments tried to fill the gap, but incentives varied so wildly that planning became nearly impossible. GM's once vaunted global supply network was now a patchwork quilt of bottlenecks and costs. Internally, executives debated whether to double down on EV investment or retreat toward high-margin gasoline trucks. Neither path offered safety. One risked bleeding cash, the other risked losing the future. Investors, lawmakers, and and workers. Each demanded different answers, leaving management paralyzed. This was the essence of strategic uncertainty. GM faced not just one storm, but several converging hurricanes, each pulling the company in a different direction. The numbers were grim, the politics divisive, and the global chessboard hostile. Even as strategies collided on paper, the real breaking point was being tested in the hearts of GM's workers. Morale and identity. Every worker kept their toolbox by the door, just in case the call never came. On shop floors across Detroit, Oshawa, and Fort Wayne, the mood had shifted from cautious optimism to weary dread. Elastic idling left workers in limbo, paid a fraction through supplemental benefits, but stripped of overtime and security. Many compared it to Lordstown in 2019, when closure rumors became reality. Yet even in the gloom, resilience flickered. Some workers volunteered at food banks for laid-off colleagues. Others tried to retrain for jobs in construction or logistics. But beneath those gestures lay a gnawing fear that the GM identity they had carried for decades was slipping away. The company was not just an employer, it was a way of life, stitched into family histories and community pride. Families who once bragged about building the heartbeat of America now whispered doubts at dinner tables. Would their children find any future in the auto industry, or was it disappearing altogether? Schools cut programs as tax revenues fell, deepening the sense that a cultural backbone was cracking. Morale was no longer measured in paychecks, but in the weight of uncertainty. GM's gamble was not just financial, it was existential. What began as a corporate crisis was no longer confined to one company. It was swelling into a national reckoning. National economy. A $5 billion hit to GM is a shock, but to the economy, it's a fault line. Automakers don't just sell cars, they are pillars holding up entire regions of tax bases, housing markets, and service economies. When GM bleeds billions, the effects ripple into state budgets and city councils. In Michigan, local governments that depended on property and income tax revenues from plant workers suddenly found themselves staring at deficits. School districts warned of cuts to sports, music, and even basic maintenance. Economists compared the unfolding crisis to 2008, when the auto industry collapse nearly toppled the financial system. Then, as now, job losses were only part of the equation. Each idled worker meant fewer groceries bought, fewer mortgages paid, and fewer diners bustling at lunch hour. The multiplier effect, the unseen economic current, turned every plant shutdown into a regional recession. Nationally, forecasts began to wobble. Analysts warned that if 50,000 jobs truly vanished, it could shave half a percentage point from quarterly GDP. That may sound small, but in a fragile economy, it was enough to spook investors and strain government safety nets. The auto sector's decline didn't stay in Detroit. It became a national concern. The cracks in the economy demanded answers, but Washington's response only deepened the uncertainty. Policy showdown. In Washington, blame moves faster than solutions. The tariff crisis was no exception. The White House doubled down, insisting the 25% duties were already bringing jobs back, despite evidence of layoffs and idled plants. At rallies, the president painted GM's pain as proof the company had become too dependent on foreign supply chains. Congress, however, fractured along familiar lines. Some lawmakers demanded immediate relief, proposing targeted subsidies for American automakers. Others argued that the tariffs were working as intended and warned that any rollback would signal weakness to foreign rivals. Behind the scenes, lobbyists flooded Capitol Hill. Auto executives pleaded for exemptions on specific components. Suppliers begged for tax credits to offset spiraling costs. Even unions sent delegations, torn between supporting protectionist rhetoric and demanding actual paychecks for their members. Behind the scenes, automakers whispered of déjà vu, recalling the bailouts of 2008. Yet this time felt different. Washington wasn't preparing rescue plans. It was sharpening knives. Each speech, each press release, became less about solutions and more about scoring political points, leaving workers trapped in the crossfire. The policy paralysis bred more instability. Wall Street traders watched each congressional hearing like a sports match, betting on whether tariffs would soften or tighten. Municipal leaders, desperate for guidance, found none. Instead, the gridlock fed uncertainty, the most toxic ingredient in a capital-intensive industry like autos. And as Washington fought itself to a standstill, another stage was preparing to steal the spotlight. While the nation's leaders pointed fingers, foreign rivals quietly raced ahead, reshaping the global auto order. Global realignment. While America argued, China built. As U.S. automakers wrestled with tariffs and shutdowns, Chinese firms doubled production of low-cost electric vehicles, targeting Europe, Africa, and Latin America with aggressive exports. BYD and Geely rolled out models priced at a fraction of American equivalents, backed by government subsidies and vertically integrated supply chains. Europe, too, seized momentum. Volkswagen and Renault accelerated their electric platforms, taking advantage of stable subsidies and clearer policies. Asian rivals like Hyundai and Toyota leaned leaned into their domestic plants, promising to fill gaps left by American retrenchment. The result was a global realignment. The United States, once the unquestioned leader of the car industry, now looked like it was playing defense. Export data told the story. In 2024, American automakers shipped nearly 2 million vehicles abroad. In 2025, that number slid by double digits, even as global demand grew. Foreign buyers increasingly turned away from American brands, citing higher costs and delivery delays. Market share slipped, and with it, prestige. GM's turmoil was no longer just a corporate crisis. It was a geopolitical shift, one that repositioned competitors as leaders of the electric future. America's faltering presence abroad circled back to the most personal stage of all, your own driveway. You've seen how America argues while global rivals race ahead. This is just the beginning, and the next moves will decide who wins the future. Don't miss what happens next. Hit subscribe right now. Stay locked in, because the choices unfolding overseas are about to hit your driveway faster than you think. The viewer's stakes. This isn't just GM's crisis. It's your paycheck, your car, your future. For consumers, the effects of tariffs and plant shutdowns were already visible. Vehicles on dealer lots carried higher sticker prices, sometimes thousands more than last year. Financing grew harder to secure as lenders tightened credit. Insurance premiums climbed, and even basic maintenance costs rose as parts shortages spread. For workers, the stakes cut even deeper. If you lived in Michigan, Indiana, Tennessee, or Ontario, your community might already be reeling from layoffs. Property values dipped as uncertainty grew. Local businesses, from diners to hardware stores, felt the pinch. Families tied to GM for generations faced the unthinkable question: was it time to leave, to abandon the towns built around the auto industry? And beyond economics lay identity. For over a century, cars symbolized American progress and independence. Now, the very heart of that identity seemed under siege. The question wasn't just whether GM would recover, but whether America could still claim to be the motor of the world. The crisis had traveled full circle, from corporate boardrooms to kitchen tables, from tariffs to family budgets. So ask yourself, what kind of America do you want to drive into? This isn't just GM's story, it's America's story. Factories, families, and futures are all caught in the fallout, and the decisions being made right now will shape every paycheck, every community, and every driveway. If this opened your eyes, hit like so more people see the truth, and drop a comment with how this impacts your world. Most importantly, subscribe, because the next chapter of this crisis is already unfolding, and you cannot afford to miss it. Stay with us, because the fight for America's auto future is only beginning.